Do you remember the little tricks your mom used in the kitchen that made dinner feel like magic? A splash of vinegar here, a stretch of leftovers there. Suddenly, nothing ever went to waste and everything tasted better than you remembered. These weren't fancy chef secrets, just everyday wisdom passed down in worn aprons and handwritten recipe cards. Somewhere along the way, we forgot them, so let's bring them back. Canned soup as sauce. Back in the 1960s, before elevated home cooking meant microgreens and Himalayan salt, there was a miracle ingredient stashed in nearly every pantry: condensed canned soup. Cream of mushroom, cream of chicken, maybe even cream of celery if you were feeling fancy. But here's the thing. No one was pouring these into bowls and calling it dinner. No, the real magic was in how those soups became sauces. A single can could turn dry noodles into a creamy casserole, tame a tough cut of meat in the oven, or pull leftovers into something brand new. It was culinary duct tape, and every mom knew how to use it. The genius was in its simplicity. Open the can, maybe thin it with a little milk or water, stir in some extras: frozen peas, shredded cheese, leftover roast chicken, and pour it over whatever starch or protein you had lying around. Then bake. That's it. The result? Comforting, creamy, deeply nostalgic. Tuna noodle casserole, chicken divan, hamburger hot dish. These weren't just meals. They were mid-century miracles pulled together in minutes by moms who had better things to do than fuss over a bechamel. Why was this such a big deal? Because it stretched time, money, and ingredients. One can, a few scoops of cooked rice, and boom, dinner for six. It was frugality disguised as luxury, a creamy cover story for economic creativity. And let's not forget the emotional part. Those casseroles came out of the oven bubbling and golden, filling kitchens with the scent of warmth and security. No wonder so many of us associate them with love. Today, we scroll through TikTok for 20-minute pasta hacks or order pre-portioned kits with tiny jars of demi-glace. But maybe, just maybe, it's time to bring back the can of cream of mushroom. Not because it's trendy, but because it worked. And let's be honest, nothing says "I love you" like a dinner that tastes like your childhood and only took one dish to make. Dry onion soup. Mix in everything. In the 1960s, the pantry staple that could make even the most uninspired meal come alive was something as simple as a packet of dry onion soup mix. It didn't matter whether you were cooking chicken, beef, or a random collection of leftovers. If you added a packet of that magic powder, you were guaranteed a meal that would leave everyone at the table thinking you'd spent hours in the kitchen. The best part? It only took a minute to mix up, and the rest was practically effortless. This soup mix wasn't just for, well, soup. Oh no, it was a shortcut to flavor that moms swore by for everything from meatloaf to pot roast to mashed potatoes. You could sprinkle it in casseroles, stir it into stews, or even use it as a seasoning for vegetables. When you mixed that little packet with a cup of sour cream, you had a dip that could save any party. Mix it with ground beef and breadcrumbs, and you had a meatloaf with the depth of flavor that would make you wonder how you'd ever lived without it. It wasn't just about flavor, it was about convenience. In an era when convenience foods were all the rage, the dry onion soup mix was a one-stop solution. With just a few ingredients, you could make something that tasted like it took much longer and involved far more effort. And let's be real, it was a lifesaver when time was short, or when you were too tired to think about anything more complicated than getting dinner on the table. In today's world, where we make our own spice blends and cook everything from scratch, the dry onion soup mix might seem like a relic of a simpler, less refined time. But here's the thing, it worked. And sometimes, maybe we need to remember that the best meals aren't the ones that are the most complicated, but the ones that are the easiest to enjoy. Evaporated milk, not cream. In the 1960s, when a trip to the grocery store wasn't a quest for superfoods and organic labels, evaporated milk was the unsung hero of countless kitchens. While cream was reserved for the occasional special dessert or Sunday brunch, evaporated milk was what kept the wheels of everyday meals turning. A pantry staple, it was budget-friendly, shelf-stable, and could be used to bring richness to dishes without the premium price tag. It's hard to believe now, but this simple can of thickened milk could transform a recipe in ways we'd usually reserve for pricier dairy. Evaporated milk didn't just find its place in coffee or desserts. It became the go-to substitute for heavy cream in casseroles, soups, and baked goods. Need a creamy texture without the guilt of full-fat cream? Reach for evaporated milk. Throw it into your meatloaf mix, stir it into mashed potatoes, or pour it into a homemade sauce to make everything feel decadent without actually being so. It was the perfect compromise between indulgence and frugality. But here's the catch. This wasn't just about saving money. It was about resourcefulness. In an era where fresh ingredients weren't always accessible, evaporated milk was a reliable workhorse. When the fridge didn't have fresh cream, evaporated milk was a can away from making everything taste just a little bit richer. And let's not forget the subtle nostalgia that comes with using it. For those of us who grew up with moms and grandmas who swore by it, there's something deeply comforting about that faintly caramelized flavor and its silky texture. Today, when we're more likely to reach for almond milk or heavy cream alternatives, it's easy to forget the charm of evaporated milk. But it's worth considering. Sometimes the most enduring kitchen tricks aren't the ones that are the trendiest, but the ones that work, over and over, year after year. Cracker crusts for meatloaf. In the world of 1960s home cooking, meatloaf was the ultimate symbol of practicality. It was simple, filling, and could be made with whatever you had on hand. But let's talk about one of the cleverest tricks passed down in those kitchens. Using cracker crumbs instead of traditional breadcrumbs for the meatloaf crust. It's a small twist, but one that took the humble loaf from basic to brilliant. The thing about crackers, whether they were saltines, Ritz, or even an off-brand variety, is that they added a certain crispness and a touch of salt that breadcrumbs just couldn't replicate. When mixed into the meatloaf filling, the crackers gave it an extra layer of texture and a savory flavor boost that made the loaf more than just ground beef and onions. But it wasn't just about the filling. It was the crust. A handful of crumbled crackers sprinkled on top before baking would create a satisfying crunch, giving each slice of meatloaf a contrast of softness and crispness. It was a texture game changer. Of course, the beauty of this trick was also in its simplicity and frugality. Crackers were often more affordable than breadcrumbs, and let's face it, when you didn't have a fancy food processor to grind your own, the pre-crushed, ready-to-go option was a lifesaver. Even better, it was the kind of kitchen hack that didn't require special ingredients or advanced culinary techniques. Just a quick rummage through the pantry. In today's world of quinoa meatballs and gluten-free breadcrumbs, it's easy to forget the charm of this classic shortcut. But honestly, There's something about the simplicity of crackers and meatloaf that just makes sense. It's a reminder that sometimes the best meals come from the most unexpected places, like a sleeve of saltines and a dash of ingenuity. And if you grew up with this trick, you probably remember it with more warmth than any fancy food trend that came after it. A pinch means a pinch. Back in the 1960s, cooking wasn't always about precise measurements or obsessing over the perfect balance of ingredients. No, back then, cooking was more about feel and instinct, something that was passed down from generation to generation. One of the most enduring pieces of wisdom from that era was the phrase, "A pinch means a pinch." It wasn't just a casual throwaway line, it was a way of life. If you asked a mom or grandmother how much salt to add to a pot of soup, or how much spice was right for the casserole, chances are you'd hear, "Oh, just a pinch." And that wasn't a vague suggestion, it was a whole philosophy of cooking. A pinch, in the world of the 60s home cooking, wasn't an exact measurement. It wasn't 1/8 a teaspoon or a sprinkle. It was whatever your fingers naturally brought together when you grabbed a little bit of something between your thumb and forefinger. It was essentially cooking by feel. No need for measuring spoons, no need for scales. Just trust your hands, your instincts, and the rhythm of your kitchen. This approach, of course, was born from necessity. In a time when convenience foods like prepackaged spices weren't yet the norm, and kitchens didn't have the latest gadgets, home cooks had to rely on what they knew best, their senses. Cooking was something done with love and experience, not by numbers. The true beauty of "a pinch means a pinch" was that it made cooking accessible and personal. It was a reminder that food was about enjoyment, not perfection. A pinch could be enough to bring a dish from bland to brilliant, simply because it was done with attention, not measurement. In today's world, we often rely on exact measurements and digital recipes, but maybe it's time to embrace that pinch again. Maybe it's time to stop overthinking and trust our hands to do the work. Because when cooking was this simple, it was also far more soulful. Teacups as measuring cups. In the 1960s, before every kitchen came equipped with sleek measuring spoons and digital scales, home cooks relied on a much more personal kind of measurement, the trusty teacup. It wasn't just a decorative relic that gathered dust on the kitchen shelf, it was a workhorse. Teacups became the unsung hero of countless recipes, doubling as makeshift measuring cups when the need arose. Forget standardized measurements. If you needed a cup of flour or sugar, you simply grabbed your favorite teacup, filled it to the top, and called it good. No conversions, no charts, just a simple, easy-to-follow guide that felt as familiar as the family recipe itself. Using teacups wasn't about precision, it was about practicality. In a time when most kitchens didn't have a set of perfectly calibrated tools, people had to make do with what they had. A teacup was usually close enough to a standard cup measurement, and no one minded if it was a little heaping or a little light. After all, when you were mixing up a batch of cookies or a loaf of bread, a few extra spoonfuls of flour here or there weren't going to make or break the dish. It was more about the rhythm of cooking, the feel of it. This makeshift approach wasn't just a quirk. It was a reflection of a time when meals were prepared with intuition, not formulas. Cooking was something passed down by generations, where measurements were learned by sight, smell, and the occasional pinch. The teacup was a subtle reminder that cooking doesn't always have to be about exactitude. Sometimes, it's the little imperfections that make food taste the best. The extra spoonful of flour that turns your pancake batter into something wonderfully thick, or the bit of sugar that takes the crust of your pie from good to great. In a world now dominated by precision and online tutorials, the teacup feels like a lost art. But maybe we could all stand to embrace a little more of that 1960s ingenuity, measuring not by numbers, but by what feels right in the moment. If it sticks, it's done. In the 1960s, home cooking wasn't a science, it was an art. And sometimes it was as simple as trusting your instincts. One of the best examples of this was a trick every seasoned cook swore by. If it sticks, it's done. It wasn't a fancy technique or a Pinterest-worthy tip. It was the kind of kitchen wisdom passed down from generations, the kind you learned from your grandmother when she taught you how to fry chicken or make pancakes. The idea was simple. When you were cooking something in a skillet, whether it was meat, vegetables, or even a pancake, the moment it was ready to flip or stir was marked by the food's natural adhesion to the pan. If it stuck, it was time. If it didn't, give it another minute. This wasn't about fancy timers or precise cooking times. It was about understanding the way heat and food interacted, something you learned by doing, not measuring. It was an unspoken rule that defined the rhythm of the kitchen. If it sticks, it's done wasn't just a cooking trick, it was a philosophy. It spoke to the era's focus on simplicity and efficiency, where culinary skills were learned through trial and error, not YouTube tutorials. The trick worked because it forced cooks to pay attention to the sounds, smells, and even the feel of the food they were preparing. It was a shortcut to experience, one that didn't require a cooking class, just the willingness to trust your senses. And sure, the world has moved on. Now we have nonstick pans, timers, and cooking apps that tell us exactly when things are done. But there's something deeply comforting about this old school trick, something that connects us to the generations before us who cooked not with gadgets, but with gut feeling. Maybe we could all use a little more of that in our kitchens today. Trusting the process, not the perfection, and knowing that sometimes the best meals come from simply feeling when something's ready. Save that bacon grease. In the 1960s, every kitchen had one thing in common: a small, greasy jar sitting on the counter, right next to the stove. It wasn't pretty, and it sure wasn't glamorous, but it was a kitchen essential that every cook swore by: the jar for saving bacon grease. Now, this might sound a little old school in the age of nonstick pans and paper towels, but back then, bacon grease was a prized ingredient that could be used for just about anything. After all, why throw out something so flavorful when you could use it to make everything from fried potatoes to cornbread, or even as a base for gravy? Saving bacon grease wasn't just about the flavor, it was about resourcefulness. The 60s were an era of frugality, where making the most out of what you had was second nature. After frying up a few strips of bacon, it didn't make sense to just toss the leftover grease away. Instead, it went into a little container to be repurposed for future meals. Bacon grease was versatile. It could be used to season a pan, fry eggs, sauté vegetables, or even as a starter for soups and stews. It added a rich, smoky depth that no other fat could match, making it the secret ingredient that elevated everyday dishes. But beyond the practicality, there was something comforting about that jar of bacon grease sitting on the counter. It became a symbol of home cooking, a reminder of an era when waste wasn't an option, and flavor was found in the simplest of ingredients. It was also a connection to family traditions. Maybe your grandmother saved her bacon grease in a porcelain jar with a lid. Or perhaps it was your mom who taught you how to use it in everything from biscuits to fried chicken. Today, we're more likely to reach for olive oil or butter. But there's something undeniably nostalgic about saving bacon grease. Something that speaks to a time when cooking was about both efficiency and indulgence. It's a small, simple act, but one that connects us to the kitchens of the past, reminding us to savor what we have and make the most of it. Everything tastes better with butter. In the 1960s, butter was more than just an ingredient. It was a way of life. Sure, today we debate about margarine versus butter, or slather on avocado toast with a side of kale, but back then, butter was the golden ticket to flavor. It was the answer to everything, from baked goods to fried chicken to vegetables that, let's be honest, would have been pretty bland without it. It wasn't just about taste, it was about richness, texture, and comfort, all packed into one creamy little stick. Butter made everything better. You didn't just use it to grease the pan. You used it to bring dishes to life. A spoonful of butter could take a pile of mashed potatoes from meh to mouth-watering. A pat on fresh corn on the cob made you feel like you just unlocked some ancient secret. And if you were baking, forget about it. Your cookies, cakes, and pies would never have that perfect crumb without a generous dose of butter. It was a secret weapon in every cook's arsenal, an ingredient that turned the simplest dishes into something magical. But beyond just the flavor, butter was a symbol of abundance and love. Back then, when processed foods were gaining popularity and convenience was becoming king, butter remained a staple because it brought a sense of authenticity. It was natural, it was real, and it was something you could trust. It didn't need fancy labels or marketing. You knew that when you used butter, you were creating something wholesome, even if it was just a humble batch of cookies or a skillet of sautéed veggies. Today, we often turn to plant-based butters or low-fat alternatives. But there's something irreplaceable about real butter. It's not just about the taste, it's the nostalgia, the warmth, the feeling of being cared for in the kitchen. So next time you reach for that margarine, remember, everything tastes better with butter. And sometimes, it's the simplest truths that make the best meals. A bit of sugar in tomato sauce. In the 1960s, home cooks knew that a good tomato sauce wasn't just about tomatoes, herbs, and garlic. There was one more secret ingredient that transformed a simple sauce into something unforgettable: a bit of sugar. It wasn't a trendy, secret hack you'd find on a food blog. No, it was a common sense addition, passed down from generations of cooks who understood that a tiny touch of sweetness could balance the acidity of tomatoes and elevate the flavor profile of any sauce. The logic behind it was simple. Tomatoes, especially the canned variety, often carried a sharp, tangy acidity. While herbs like basil or oregano could complement that bite, they didn't always mellow it out. A pinch of sugar, on the other hand, brought everything together. It wasn't about making the sauce sweet, far from it. Rather, it was about creating harmony, a delicate balance that allowed the savory, rich elements to shine without overwhelming the taste buds. Moms and grandmas swore by this little trick. It wasn't an exact science, just a pinch here, a small spoonful there. It didn't matter if you were simmering a marinara for spaghetti or a chunky sauce for a casserole. That bit of sugar rounded out the flavors and gave the sauce a smooth, well-rounded finish. It was a simple and effective way to transform a basic dish into something special without a lot of fuss. Today, the idea of adding sugar to tomato sauce might seem strange, especially with all the gourmet, no sugar added, and clean eating trends floating around. But there's something deeply comforting about that small, homey touch. It's a reminder that sometimes the best dishes come from those little tricks. Ingredients and techniques passed down, not because they were trendy, but because they simply worked. So the next time you find yourself stirring a pot of tomato sauce, consider reaching for that sugar bowl. It's a small gesture that might just bring a big wave of nostalgia. Brown it before you bake it. In the 1960s, when it came to roasting meats, casseroles, or even meatloaf, there was one golden rule that most home cooks lived by: brown it before you bake it. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a fundamental step in making sure your dish came out flavorful and perfectly cooked. The idea was simple but effective. Sear the meat or the exterior of whatever you were baking in a hot pan before transferring it to the oven. It wasn't about showing off technique. It was about coaxing the best possible flavor out of your ingredients. Why brown it first? Well, browning creates a beautiful caramelized crust that locks in juices and flavors. Whether it was a roast chicken, a meatloaf, or a pan of vegetables, giving it a quick sear before baking gave that dish a rich depth of flavor that would otherwise be missing. The Maillard reaction, fancy name, right, was at work here, turning proteins and sugars into something golden and delicious. It was a shortcut to that deep, savory taste that made everything from stews to roasts so irresistible. In the world of 1960s home cooking, this technique didn't require fancy gadgets or a sous vide machine. Just a hot skillet, a little oil, and patience. It was the kind of kitchen wisdom passed down through generations, a piece of advice that made everyday meals feel just a little more like something special. Browning wasn't a step you could skip. It was about setting a solid foundation of flavor. Today, we might be tempted to skip this step for convenience, throwing a roast straight into the oven with little more than a drizzle of olive oil. But the truth is, browning adds something essential: flavor, texture, and richness. So, next time you're baking that meatloaf or prepping your chicken, remember the old rule. It might add a few minutes to the process, but the results? Worth every second. Mayonnaise in cake batter. In the 1960s, when the world of home baking was still largely defined by simple, straightforward ingredients, one of the most unexpected tricks to create a moist, flavorful cake was the addition of mayonnaise to the batter. Yes, you read that right. Mayonnaise, that creamy, tangy condiment, usually reserved for sandwiches, potato salad, and coleslaw, became the secret weapon in making cakes unbelievably rich and moist. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, let's break it down. The thing about mayonnaise is that it's essentially an emulsion of oil, eggs, and vinegar, three key ingredients already found in cake recipes. So when you added mayonnaise, you weren't just tossing something strange into the mix. You were enhancing the fat content and moisture in a way that was more seamless than butter or oil alone. The result was a cake that stayed tender for days, with a soft crumb and a depth of flavor that you'd never expect from such a humble addition. Back then, the trick was especially popular because it worked with pantry staples and didn't require any fancy ingredients. You didn't have to go out and buy a special cake mix or search for hard-to-find items. Just grab the jar of mayonnaise from the fridge, mix it in, and you were good to go. It was one of those shortcuts that made it easy to impress guests or make a simple dessert feel special. Chocolate cakes, lemon cakes, and even spice cakes all benefited from the extra richness that mayonnaise brought to the table. Sure, in today's world, we might laugh at the idea of mayonnaise in a cake, especially when we're all about clean ingredients and plant-based alternatives. But there's something timeless about that 1960s ingenuity. The kind of creativity that made something as simple as a jar of mayo feel like the key to unlocking the perfect cake. Sometimes, it's the unexpected ingredients that make the biggest impact. Jell-O everything. Molds, salads, weirdness. If there's one ingredient that truly defined the 1960s kitchen, it was Jell-O. Whether it was in a mold, turned into a salad, or just casually added to anything for that jiggly texture, Jell-O was the star of the show in many homes across America. The decade's fascination with convenience and novelty meant that this colorful, wobbly treat found its way into dishes you'd never expect, and some you still wouldn't expect today. Jell-O at its best was versatile and affordable. Cooks could whip it up in a flash, and the result was always a dish that felt festive, even if it was just a Tuesday night. But the 60s weren't just about simple desserts. They were about pushing the boundaries of what food could be. And that meant using Jell-O in ways that made modern diners cringe. It wasn't uncommon to see gelatin-based salads where the sweet fruit flavors were combined with savory ingredients like shredded carrots, celery, and even mayonnaise. Yes, that tangy, creamy dressing was often folded into gelatin, creating a bizarre but somehow delicious contrast. Then there were the infamous molded Jell-O dishes. Picture a lime green creation with bits of canned fruit suspended inside, served as a side dish for Thanksgiving dinner. Or perhaps a bright red Jell-O mold adorned with sliced hard-boiled eggs, a dish that even today would make you question your life choices. But in the 60s, these creations were a sign of culinary creativity. Food was about novelty and fun, and nothing was too weird to try. The more colorful, the more jiggly, the better. Of course, Jell-O in the 60s wasn't all weird. It was also the base for many beloved desserts like Jell-O parfaits or the classic Jell-O salad that often appeared at family gatherings. But there's no denying that the era's infatuation with Jell-O led to some truly head-scratching food trends. Yet, whether you loved it or hated it, you can't deny the power of Jell-O in creating memories, often with a side of humor. Boxed cake mix plus doctoring. There was a time when boxed cake mix felt like science fiction in the kitchen. In the 1960s, it promised a perfect cake every time. No sifting, no guesswork, just water, oil, and eggs. But here's the thing. No mom worth her Pyrex followed the box exactly. Those instructions? A polite starting point. The real art was in the doctoring, transforming a humble mix into something moist, rich, and unmistakably homemade with whatever extras were lurking in the pantry. A scoop of sour cream could turn a dry yellow cake into something lush and bakery-like. An extra egg added heft, giving the crumb more body. Instant pudding mix, folded in with a wink, made cakes so soft they practically begged for another slice. Cans of fruit, pineapple, peaches, even cherry pie filling were dumped into batters with no shame and plenty of applause. And let's not forget the most notorious trick of all, mayonnaise in chocolate cake. It sounded scandalous, but guaranteed moisture, a Depression-era hack that survived into suburban kitchens with good reason. Doctoring wasn't about being fancy, it was about pride and practicality. Why settle for plain when a splash of leftover coffee could deepen chocolate? Or a spoonful of almond extract could make white cake taste like wedding tears? These tweaks were traded like gossip, scribbled in margins of cookbooks, whispered at bake sales, shared over the backyard fence. By the time the cake was frosted with Cool Whip and crowned with coconut or sprinkles, it was no longer from a box, it was family. Today, boxed cake mixes still line the shelves, but we've forgotten the quiet genius of treating them as a blank canvas rather than a finished product. Maybe it's time to bring back the pudding packets and fruit stir-ins to let practicality meet nostalgia. Because sometimes the best cakes aren't about perfection. They're about the clever ways moms made them better. Applesauce as egg substitute. Long before plant-based became a trendy phrase or vegan baking went viral on TikTok, thrifty home cooks already knew the quiet power of applesauce. In the 1960s, it wasn't about dietary restrictions or saving the planet. It was about saving pennies and stretching what you had. Eggs weren't always expensive, but they weren't always plentiful either, especially in large families or during seasons when grocery budgets were tight. A jar of applesauce, often homemade from backyard windfalls or bought cheap in bulk, could quietly step in and do the job. The science behind it is surprisingly elegant. Eggs provide moisture and structure in baked goods, and applesauce, thick, sweet, and full of natural pectin, could mimic both. A quarter cup for each egg left out of the recipe was enough to keep cakes tender, muffins moist, and cookies soft without anyone guessing the difference. Better yet, applesauce added its own subtle sweetness, letting moms shave a few tablespoons off the sugar without sacrificing flavor. In an era when every penny and calorie counted, that little jar was a double win. It wasn't only frugality at play, it was convenience too. Applesauce sat patiently in the pantry, never demanding refrigeration or worrying about cracking shells. On a rainy afternoon, when kids begged for something warm from the oven, there was no need to run to the store. A scoop of applesauce into the mixing bowl meant dessert could happen on the spot, no eggs required. Today, health-conscious bakers are rediscovering the trick for entirely different reasons. Vegan blogs tout it, dietitians recommend it for reducing fat and cholesterol, and parents slip it into snacks for extra fruit content. What was once a quiet budget hack is now a celebrated swap in modern kitchens. Yet the heart of it remains the same. Simple ingenuity born out of making do. Next time you're missing eggs, or just craving a softer, slightly fruit-kissed crumb, reach for that jar of applesauce. Your grandmother might not have called it vegan baking, but she certainly knew a clever shortcut when she saw one. Boil the bones for broth. There was a time when nothing in the kitchen was truly thrown away. Chicken bones, ham hocks, beef knuckles, all of them were destined for one more act of service: broth. In the 1960s, when frugality was still stitched into daily life, boiling the bones wasn't just a trick, it was an unspoken rule. After Sunday dinner, when the roast had been picked clean, those bones went straight into a stock pot. Add water, a pinch of salt, maybe an onion skin or a limp carrot from the crisper, and suddenly scraps became the foundation for an entire week's worth of soups, gravies, and casseroles. The beauty of this method was its patience. There was no rush. Bones simmered low and slow, filling the house with a savory aroma that clung to curtains and made neighbors jealous. The longer it bubbled, the richer it became. Gelatin leached from the bones, giving the cooled broth a satisfying wobble, a sign of true success that no canned variety could mimic. It wasn't just about flavor, it was about respect for what you had. Wasting food was unthinkable in households shaped by wartime rationing and depression memories. Broth was liquid thrift, stretching a single chicken into multiple meals. A pot of it on the stove felt like security, a promise that dinner tomorrow was already halfway solved. Fast forward to today, and bone broth is sold in sleek cartons and mason jars at boutique prices, pitched as a superfood rather than the humble necessity it once was. Wellness trends might celebrate its collagen and minerals, but your grandmother knew those benefits without ever needing a label. For her, broth was comfort, economy, and a quiet bit of culinary magic. The next time you're left with a bare carcass, resist the urge to toss it. Cover it with water, let it whisper on the stove for hours, and watch humble scraps transform into something soul-soothing. It's not just broth, it's history simmering in your pot. Stretch with noodles or rice. Before meal prep was a buzzword and budget cooking blogs filled the internet, stretching a meal was a quiet art practiced in every modest kitchen. In the 1960s, nothing stretched food further or comforted hungry bellies faster than a pot of noodles or a pan of rice. These starches weren't just side dishes, they were the unsung heroes of frugality, transforming small amounts of meat or vegetables into full, satisfying meals. A pound of ground beef could be seasoned, browned, and stirred into macaroni to feed 6. Leftover roast chicken, shredded and folded into rice with a can of cream of mushroom soup, became an instant casserole worthy of a church supper. Even a scant handful of vegetables, peas, celery, or whatever was wilting in the crisper, could disappear into a big pot of chicken and rice soup, turning scraps into something that tasted like care. It was thrift, but it felt generous. There was practicality in this ritual, too. Rice and pasta were cheap, shelf-stable, and endlessly adaptable. Moms kept them on hand the way modern cooks keep frozen pizza or meal kits, ready for emergencies, fast dinners, or unexpected guests. With a single pot and a little seasoning, dinner could stretch as far as it needed to without anyone feeling deprived. The emotional weight of these meals lingered longer than anyone realized. A bowl of buttered noodles after school, a scoop of chicken and rice on Sunday night. These were small luxuries born of necessity, feeding bodies and softening hard days. And though today's recipes call them carb-heavy or old-fashioned, they remain quietly unbeatable for feeding a crowd on a dime. Modern cooks might chase cauliflower rice and zoodles, but when you're truly hungry, nothing replaces the honest comfort of starch. The next time your pantry looks bare, remember the wisdom of stretching. A little protein, a lot of noodles or rice, and the quiet satisfaction of turning not enough into plenty. Leftovers or tomorrow soup. In mid-century kitchens, soup wasn't so much a recipe as it was an inevitability. The minute dinner plates were cleared, frugal hands swept bones, scraps of meat, stray carrots, and even yesterday's mashed potatoes into a waiting pot or freezer bag. This was the quiet ritual of the 1960s household. Nothing wasted, everything transformed. By tomorrow, those odds and ends would be simmering on the stove, reincarnated as soup that somehow tasted better than the meal it came from. It was an elegant solution to a daily problem: how to feed a family well without spending more than you had. A single roast chicken stretched itself into sandwiches, then into broth, then into a soup bulked up with rice, barley, or egg noodles. Wilted celery and forgotten carrots in the crisper were suddenly reborn as aromatic flavor builders, their imperfections hidden in the bubbling pot. Even the potato water saved from last night's mash could be poured in, thickening the broth while adding a whisper of earthiness. The genius wasn't just thrift, it was timing. Soup rewarded patience. Leftovers needed hours to marry flavors, and moms understood this without needing cookbooks or food science jargon. By the time the pot lid rattled softly on a weekday afternoon, the house smelled like comfort itself: herbal, meaty, and undeniably home. Today, we chase zero-waste cooking as though it's a revelation, buying pricey stock bones in specialty jars to mimic what was once instinct. We forget that our grandmothers didn't need hashtags to be sustainable. They simply made soup. They knew that by giving yesterday's meal another life, they weren't just saving money. They were creating something deeper and so richer than the sum of its scraps. The next time leftovers linger in your fridge, look past the mismatched containers and see potential. Toss them into a pot, add water, salt, and a slow flame. What you'll have by dinner isn't just soup. It's proof that care and creativity can turn almost nothing into everything. Everything in one casserole dish. There was a time when a single casserole dish could solve almost any dinner dilemma. In the 1960s, with hungry kids, limited budgets, and tight schedules, this humble baking dish became the stage for a kind of culinary alchemy. Leftovers, pantry staples, and the magic of condensed soup came together under one layer of melted cheese or buttered crumbs, transforming what's on hand into something that looked like a plan. The formula was simple but brilliant: a starch to fill you up, a bit of protein to make it feel hearty, some vegetables, fresh, frozen, or frankly canned, and a sauce to bind it all together. A handful of shredded cheese or cracker crumbs sprinkled over the top turned even the most modest ingredients into something that felt celebratory. It didn't matter if it was Tuesday night or Sunday potluck. Casseroles carried a quiet dignity. They fed a crowd without complaint and looked perfectly at home on any table, from church socials to weekday suppers. Condensed soups, mushroom, celery, chicken, were the secret weapon, instantly creating creamy, savory sauces with zero fuss. Rice or noodles stretched the dish further, ensuring no one left the table hungry. And the genius was in the layering. Leftovers disappeared into harmony, their humble origins forgotten under a bubbling golden crust. For many families, casseroles weren't just food. They were routine, comfort, and thrift bundled in Pyrex. Children grew up watching their mothers make do without realizing they were learning a quiet kind of creativity. A bare fridge didn't mean going without. It meant opening the pantry, eyeing the dish, and trusting that somehow it would all work. Today, casserole culture feels quaint, eclipsed by sheet pans and meal kits, but its charm endures. One dish, minimal cleanup, maximum satisfaction, that's timeless. The next time you stare at random odds and ends, do what they did. Layer, bake, and let the oven turn scraps into supper. Boil it, bake it, forget it. There's a certain genius to recipes that practically cook themselves, and mid-century moms had mastered the art long before "set it and forget it" became a marketing slogan. The 1960s kitchen was busy terrain, kids underfoot, laundry piling high, and dinner still expected on the table at 6. Enter the ultimate survival strategy: boil it, bake it, forget it. These were meals that asked for a few minutes of hands-on work, then rewarded you hours later with something bubbling and fragrant, as if the kitchen had done the heavy lifting on its own. It began with big pots and simple ingredients. A chicken boiled with an onion and carrot wasn't just dinner. It was the start of several meals, from broth to casseroles to next-day soup. A ham bone could simmer away all afternoon while Mom folded laundry, the gentle steam perfuming the whole house. Baking followed the same principle. Meatloaf, scalloped potatoes, or a casserole assembled in 10 minutes could be slid into the oven and promptly forgotten while life went on elsewhere in the house. The aroma served as the only timer needed. When the air smelled done, dinner was ready. This wasn't laziness, but efficiency born of necessity. In households without microwaves or fancy slow cookers, time-stretching meals meant you could feed a crowd without standing at the stove. It also allowed flavors to deepen naturally. Long boils coaxing richness from bones, low bakes transforming humble ingredients into something comforting and cohesive. Today, we romanticize this approach as low and slow cooking, complete with Dutch ovens and artisan marketing. Back then, it was just Tuesday. And yet, the method still works. The next time your day threatens to overtake your evening plans, toss ingredients into a pot, slide something into the oven, and walk away. By the time you remember it, the house will smell like home, and dinner will be waiting, just like it always did. Rice under meat? Always. In the kitchens of the 1960s, there was an unspoken rule that lived somewhere between tradition and practical genius. Rice goes under the meat. Always. It wasn't just about soaking up sauce, though that was certainly part of the appeal. It was about stretching dinner, anchoring it, giving it substance. A few chicken thighs might not look like enough to feed a family of 5, but lay them over a bed of white rice, drizzle the pan juices on top, and suddenly you had a meal that felt abundant, hearty, and whole. This layering technique wasn't fussy or fancy. It was survival with a touch of style. In a world where one-pot meals reigned supreme and nothing went to waste, rice was the foundation that caught every drop of flavor. It absorbed the garlic and onion, the butter and drippings, the caramelized bits from the roast pan. What might have been left behind or scrubbed off became dinner's best bite. Moms knew that the real prize wasn't the drumstick. It was the spoonful of rice underneath, sticky with gravy, and speckled with seasoning. The method worked whether you were making pork chops, baked chicken, or even meatballs in tomato sauce. No matter the protein, the principle remained. Cook the meat, let it drip its goodness, and serve it over rice so not a single bit went to waste. It was flavor insurance, frugality, and comfort all in one. Today, food culture is full of grain bowls and deconstructed dinners, but somehow we've drifted from this foundational wisdom. We separate everything, serve meat beside rice instead of over it, as if we've forgotten what makes a dish feel complete. But that base layer, soft, seasoned, quietly carrying the weight of the whole meal, is where the heart lives. So the next time you're planning dinner, don't overthink it. Put the rice under the meat. Let the juices do their job. and watch how an ordinary dish turns into something rich, nostalgic, and deeply satisfying, just the way Mom used to make it, frozen spinach and everything. In the 1960s, frozen spinach was the quiet workhorse of the freezer aisle. It didn't have the glamour of frozen peas or the sweetness of corn, but it had one major advantage. You could stir it into almost anything and feel virtuous about it. Back then, nutrition wasn't marketed in smoothie bowls or superfood powders. It was slipped into casseroles, soups, and dips with a wink. A brick of frozen spinach, thawed and squeezed dry, could vanish into lasagna, meatloaf, or even scrambled eggs. And suddenly dinner felt greener, healthier, without much effort or cost. This was frugality at its finest. Fresh spinach wilted in days, expensive and temperamental. Frozen spinach, on the other hand, waited patiently for months, a compact block of leafy insurance ready to rescue any meal that needed stretching or dressing up. Moms knew its quiet power. A handful stirred into creamed soups, thickened them, folded into pasta added color, and baked into casseroles made them feel oddly elegant, like something you'd see in a church cookbook photo spread. Perhaps the most famous trick of all was spinach dip, that retro party favorite hiding in hollowed-out bread bowls. What looked indulgent was, at its core, simply spinach meeting sour cream and seasoning packets, affordable, impressive, and practically mandatory at potlucks. Even picky kids who balked at green stuff didn't notice it hidden in cheesy noodles or folded into hamburger patties. Today, frozen spinach still lines supermarket shelves, but it's often overlooked for flashier greens or bagged fresh leaves. Yet the wisdom remains. Spinach makes everything better. It stretches sauces, adds nutrients, and brings color to plates without stealing the spotlight. The next time you're staring into your freezer wondering what's for dinner, remember the humble green brick. Drop it into soup, tuck it into pasta, stir it into rice. You'll be surprised how seamlessly it disappears, leaving behind only comfort and quiet satisfaction. Canned peas with a butter blanket. For many mid-century families, canned peas were less a choice and more an inevitability. They appeared on dinner plates with the same regularity as sliced white bread, a dependable splash of green against meatloaf or fried pork chops. Fresh peas were fleeting, and frozen peas were still a novelty. Canned peas, with their soft texture and muted sweetness, were what most kitchens could count on. Yet these humble legumes needed help. Enter the butter blanket. The trick was simple. Drain the peas, warm them gently, and drape them in a generous pat of butter. A sprinkle of salt, maybe a dash of pepper, and suddenly those pale green orbs transformed from obligatory vegetable to quiet comfort food. The butter softened their metallic edge, turning them glossy and indulgent. It wasn't fancy, but it was reliable. A small luxury that made budget dinners feel complete. This ritual carried a kind of quiet charm. Children might groan at peas on their plate, but the buttery sheen usually won them over by the second bite. Moms knew the value of this little flourish. It was affordable magic. A single can could stretch to feed several, and the butter, always kept on the counter, soft and ready, was the finishing touch that made the meal taste cared for. Today, canned peas rarely get their due. We chase fresh snap peas or frozen petite varieties, forgetting that for generations, the pantry staple was the backbone of weeknight vegetables. And while modern palates might prefer firmer textures, there's something nostalgic about that buttery softness. the way it mingled with mashed potatoes or soaked up gravy on the plate. Next time you pass the canned aisle, consider tossing a few into your cart. Warm them, butter them, season them simply, and see if they don't taste a little like memory. Sometimes comfort lives in the quietest corners of the kitchen, in this case, under a blanket of butter. Root cellar staples. Before refrigeration became standard in every home, the root cellar was the kitchen's quiet partner in survival. Even into the 1960s, especially in rural areas or older homes, many families still relied on these cool, dark storage spaces to keep staples fresh through long seasons. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable and packed with culinary wisdom. Potatoes, onions, carrots, beets, turnips, and winter squash all found refuge here, lined up in crates or tucked in straw, waiting patiently to be peeled, boiled, roasted, or mashed. These weren't just background vegetables, they were the base of everything. They bulked out stews, anchored Sunday roasts, and turned meat drippings into something substantial. A bag of potatoes could feed a family for a week, stretching into mashed potatoes one night, fried cakes the next, and perhaps a chowder to close the loop. Onions added flavor to nearly every dish, quietly sweating away in butter at the start of the meal. Carrots and turnips sweetened long boils, while squash brought a creamy richness to casseroles and baked dishes. Keeping root cellar staples wasn't just about cost, it was about rhythm. These vegetables didn't rush. They didn't spoil in days like lettuce or demand ice boxes like milk. They were steady and strong, lasting from harvest through winter and sometimes into spring. You learned to cook what was on hand, not chase what was out of season. It shaped how meals were planned and how flavor developed. Earthy, slow, deeply satisfying. Today, we fill refrigerators with delicate greens and imported produce, often overlooking the humble roots sitting quietly in their bins. But these staples still have something to teach us about patience, resilience, and the beauty of food that doesn't need to be flashy to be good. When your fridge looks bare but your pantry still holds a few potatoes or onions, remember the root cellar. And remember the cooks who turned those everyday vegetables into meals that warmed whole households? Pickled everything. There was a time when the sound of canning lids popping shut in late summer signaled more than just food preservation. It was security. In the 1960s, pickling wasn't a hobby or a trend. It was survival wrapped in vinegar and glass. Cucumbers, of course, were the star, but almost anything could end up in a brine if it meant stretching the harvest. Green beans, beets, onions, okra, even watermelon rinds. If it grew in the garden, chances were good it would spend time soaking in salt and vinegar before the year was out. The genius of pickling was how it turned abundance into insurance. When gardens overflowed in August, there was no way a family could eat it all fresh. But drop those vegetables into jars, add hot brine, and suddenly you had bright, tangy bursts of flavor waiting for winter's dullest days. A spoonful of pickled beets next to meatloaf or a spear of dill alongside fried chicken wasn't just garnish. It was summer preserved. A reminder that even in February, the garden still fed you. Pickling also spoke to the era's creativity. Every family had its quirks. Extra sugar for sweet bread and butter chips, a pinch of mustard seed, a garlic clove tucked in the jar. Recipes were handwritten, traded at church socials, and fiercely defended as the right way. It was an edible tradition, passed down in stained index cards and taught over steaming kettles. Today, artisan pickling is back, repackaged as gourmet, and sold in farmers markets with craft labels. But beneath the trend is the same humble wisdom. Don't waste what you've grown, and don't underestimate the power of vinegar and spice. The next time you bite into a crunchy pickle or fork up a tangy beet slice, remember the kitchens where this began. Not in restaurants, but in homes where jars lined the shelves like jewels, each one a promise that nothing from the garden would go unloved. Pancakes equals budget dinner. There's something undeniably comforting about breakfast for dinner. And in the 1960s, pancakes were the ultimate budget-friendly way to pull it off. When the pantry felt bare and payday was still days away, a bowl of flour, a splash of milk, and a single egg could turn into a stack of golden cakes big enough to feed the whole table. No one called it breakfast for dinner back then. It was just dinner and nobody complained. Pancakes were pure pragmatism disguised as a treat. They were quick, cheap, and endlessly adaptable. A few mashed bananas or a handful of berries could be stirred in if you had them. If not, plain pancakes with a drizzle of syrup, or even a dusting of sugar, did the job just fine. Butter was the real star, melting into every crevice and soaking the edges until the stack glistened. For families stretched thin, this meal felt almost indulgent, a soft reprieve from stews and casseroles that often leaned heavy on leftovers. Part of their magic was emotional, too. Kids loved the novelty of it. Watching mom flip pancakes at dinner time felt like breaking a rule. The kitchen smelled sweeter than usual, and the table buzzed with the kind of excitement only a last-minute pancake supper could bring. In homes where money was tight, those moments mattered. Simple ingredients turning into joy on a Tuesday night. Today, pancakes still sneak their way onto dinner tables, though often framed as quirky or ironic rather than practical. We dress them up with whipped cream, flavored syrups, or Instagram-worthy toppings, forgetting that their greatest strength has always been their simplicity. A stack of pancakes doesn't need much. Just a hot griddle, a steady hand, and the quiet confidence of knowing you've turned not much into plenty. The next time dinner feels impossible, remember the old kitchen trick. Pull out the skillet, mix what you have, and flip until golden. With each pancake stacked, you'll see why generations before us swore by this humble meal. Frugal, filling, and every bit as comforting as it was 60 years ago. Eggs are always there for you. In mid-century kitchens, when money ran low or plans went sideways, there was always one ingredient you could count on: eggs. They were the quiet hero of the fridge, humble but endlessly adaptable, ready to become breakfast, lunch, or dinner at a moment's notice. A dozen eggs could feed a family in half a dozen ways: scrambled, poached, baked into custards, or stretched into omelets stuffed with whatever vegetables or scraps of meat were lying around. In an era without drive-thrus on every corner, eggs were fast food in its purest, most honest form. Part of their magic was affordability. Even in lean years, eggs were relatively cheap, offering a hit of protein without draining the grocery budget. A couple of fried eggs over toast could turn into a full meal, especially when paired with yesterday's potatoes or a few slices of canned ham. Hard-boiled, they became lunchbox staples. Deviled, they were the star of church potlucks. And when desserts were on the menu, eggs gave cakes their lift, custards their creaminess, and meringues their dramatic peaks. But eggs were more than utility. They were comfort. The sound of them cracking into a hot skillet, the smell of butter browning around their edges, the sight of golden yolks pooling onto a plate. All of it signaled safety, home, and care. Children might not have noticed the frugality behind the meal, but they felt the warmth in every bite. Today, eggs still hold that quiet reliability, though we now fuss over free-range labels and omega-3 content. Yet their essence hasn't changed. They wait patiently in the fridge, ready to rescue dinner plans gone wrong, or turn bare cupboards into something nourishing. The next time you wonder what's for dinner, glance at that carton. Chances are the answer has been sitting there all along, just as it always was. Sunday roast becomes Tuesday hash. In the rhythm of mid-century kitchens, the Sunday roast was more than just a meal. It was the centerpiece of the week. A golden chicken or a slab of beef, ringed with carrots and potatoes, would emerge from the oven to feed the whole family, filling the house with the kind of aroma that drew neighbors to the door. Plates were heaped generously, gravy flowed freely, and for a moment, the week's worries seemed to dissolve into that single, abundant feast. But the genius of the Sunday roast wasn't just Sunday, it was what came after. Come Tuesday, that same roast lived a second life as hash. Leftover meat, chopped fine, met diced potatoes and onions in a sizzling skillet. A little butter or saved bacon grease coaxed everything into crispy edges, transforming scraps into something entirely new. The result was hearty, frugal, and deeply satisfying. A meal that whispered, "We made it stretch." Hash was born of necessity but carried a kind of creative pride. Nothing went to waste. Even the bits clinging to the bone were scraped and added to the pan. Moms didn't see leftovers, they saw potential. A fried egg on top could turn hash into breakfast for dinner. A splash of gravy or ketchup made it taste indulgent on a Tuesday night. Today, hash is dressed up on brunch menus with artisanal meats and fancy herbs, but its heart remains the same. It's about reinvention, about honoring what you've already cooked rather than starting from scratch. That wisdom, stretching food without sacrificing comfort, is worth remembering in a world that prizes novelty over resourcefulness. The next time a roast graces your table, plan ahead. Savor it on Sunday, but save enough to chop and fry a couple days later. You'll find that the second meal, humble and crispy at the edges, carries just as much comfort as the first, maybe more. The fridge buffet. Every mid-century family knew this scene. A refrigerator crammed with small plates, half-covered bowls, and jars of mysterious contents left over from dinners past. Nothing matched, nothing coordinated, and yet, by some miracle, this jumble could be transformed into a meal. Enter the fridge buffet, a weeknight ritual that turned odds and ends into a spread that felt almost celebratory. The concept was simple. Lay everything out, from last night's meatloaf slices to the spoonful of green beans no one finished. Cold fried chicken, a lonely baked potato, a few pickles lingering in brine, they all had a place on the table. Children got to choose their favorites, adults claimed whatever hadn't been picked over, and somehow everyone left full. It wasn't wasteful, it was resourceful. A little reheating here, a drizzle of gravy there, and mismatched scraps turned into dinner without anyone having to cook from scratch. This was frugality disguised as freedom. For mothers managing both tight budgets and tighter schedules, a fridge buffet bought precious time. No one expected uniform plates or perfect presentation. The charm was in the variety. in the small thrill of seeing Tuesday's pork roast, rubbing elbows with Thursday's spaghetti. It was like grazing at a diner built entirely from your own kitchen history. The fridge buffet also had an unspoken emotional warmth. Kids loved the sense of choice, adults enjoyed the break from formal meals, and everyone felt oddly satisfied knowing nothing went to waste. Even the last sliver of pie or half-empty jar of applesauce found its moment to shine. Today, we dress up the idea as grazing boards or leftovers night. But the principle is the same. Use what you have, skip the fuss, and make it feel intentional. Next time your fridge looks chaotic, don't sigh. Set out the bowls, call it a buffet, and watch mismatched leftovers transform into the easiest dinner of the week. Cook with what you have. In the kitchens of the 1960s, there was no romantic notion of pantry challenges or curated meal plans. You simply cooked with what you had. If the recipe called for milk and you only had powdered, you whisked it with water and kept going. No sour cream. A splash of vinegar in evaporated milk did the trick. Dinner didn't pause for missing ingredients. It adapted, improvised, and carried on without complaint. This philosophy was born out of both practicality and thrift. Grocery trips were less frequent, pantries were smaller, and budgets were tighter. When a storm rolled in or the car wouldn't start, you didn't panic. You eyed the cans stacked in the cupboard and figured something out. Rice could stand in for noodles, breadcrumbs for crackers, applesauce for eggs. Recipes weren't rules. They were gentle suggestions meant to be molded to the moment. The meals that came out of this mindset weren't always fancy, but they were always resourceful. A can of tuna became patties when mashed with leftover mashed potatoes. Stale bread turned into bread pudding or croutons. A lonely carrot and half an onion bulked up soups and stews. And because nothing went to waste, every scrap carried a quiet kind of respect. The sense that food, no matter how humble, had value. Today, we're conditioned to run to the store for one missing ingredient, to believe a dish is ruined without the right spice or garnish. But mid-century cooks knew better. The best meals often came from substitutions and creativity. That improvisation wasn't just survival, it was skill. The kind that turned scarcity into abundance. The next time you stare into your pantry and sigh, take a lesson from those kitchens. Work with what's there. Trust that a can of beans, a handful of rice, and a little seasoning can turn into something comforting. Cooking with what you have isn't just practical, it's an invitation to rediscover the quiet magic of making do. That's a wrap on our stroll through the clever kitchen wisdom of the 60s. Proof that a little thrift and creativity can turn the simplest ingredients into something unforgettable. If these tricks sparked a memory or inspired you to try one tonight, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves a bit of kitchen nostalgia, and subscribe for more forgotten food secrets brought back to life.